This is a China-only CPU called the Ryzen R5 3500X, and it's not a knockoff. It's actually an AMD China-only release using the modern Zen 2 architecture and a sound translation of Ryzen to Mandarin. The box makes it clear that we had to buy this online, and it's only available to the US via eBay or retailers like AliExpress, Taobao, or JD. The R5 3500X is a 6-core, 6-thread part that runs a boost frequency of 4.1 GHz, base of 3.6 GHz, and is unlocked for overclocking. The 3600, for comparison, has a 4.2 GHz maximum boost, 100 MHz higher, but still has the same cache, base clock, and physical cores, with the notable difference that it does have SMT and 12 threads, rather than the 6 and 6 setup of the 3500X. Today, we're benchmarking the R5 3500X versus everything else on the charts. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Gigabyte X299X Designare high-end motherboard. The Gigabyte X299X Designare runs Intel's X299 chipset for HEDT CPUs, but this board stands out most for its properly finned VRM heatsinks and cooling solution, and its focus on networking with dual 10 gigabit Ethernet alongside Wi-Fi 6 802.11ax support. Learn more at the link in the description below. We already covered most of the differences in the intro there, but there's one more, which is that AMD's website also lists that the 3500X includes a Wraith Spire, and it says that the R5 3600 has a Wraith Stealth. And ours, we did check the part number on the cooler, and it is an, let's see, it's an AMD 712000046 Rev C, which nobody knows what any of these coolers are called. So if you try to look that number up, you'll find both Spire and Stealth attributed to that specific part number. But anyway, there's the part number for you. What really matters, though, is the CPU itself. And the obvious difference is 6 cores, 6 threads instead of 6 and 12. 100 megahertz, yeah, that has some play on performance, especially once you start looking at more heavily multi-threaded applications where it won't be max boost, but it'll be hopefully a higher boost for something like Blender across all the cores. You start seeing the difference really materialize there. So the pricing is probably the next most important thing. This is anywhere from $120, maybe a bit lower sometimes, to $200, depending on where you go and if you get ripped off. So we needed it quickly, which means we did pay for expedited shipping, all that stuff. It ended up being a little over $200 after we paid for the fastest possible shipping from China. And if you're willing to wait maybe 5 weeks to get it from AliExpress or something, or I think we saw it on Taobao also for similar pricing, at time of filming, it was listed at $120 USD, which if you get it with the cheaper shipping options, maybe isn't so bad. That said, you can also get an R5 2600 these days, or 2600X even, for not too distant of a price from the 120 baseline of the 3500X as it's listed today. So just obviously this thing's probably not going to be worth it for most buyers in the West, but it's still interesting to look at, and who knows, maybe it'll be worth it as the price moves around in the future. There have been a few theories about performance where we've seen some speculation that because of the lack of SMT, there might be an improvement in performance versus the 3600 because there's less like contention or something going on in the cores. Realistically, that's not happening. This is technically slower. It does have a lower boost clock, which will matter, and it's the same CPU. It just has half the threads. And even in scenarios where threads don't matter that much, you're still going to see, on average, better performance out of a stock 3600, or at least equal. And we'll look at games like GTA 5 to eliminate threads as even a consideration and go through our benchmarks with some mix of old and new. The only other reason you'd gain some performance is from Precision Boost 2, which is different from PBO. PB2 would allow higher boosting. If, for example, on a 3600 you disable SMT, one of the things that you do is reduce the heat density on the CPU. You're going to lower T-die as a result, and then improve the clocks, because stock performance out of box, PB2 will boost the clocks higher for every couple degrees lower that your CPU is. So that would be another factor to consider. Anyway, let's get into the benchmarks. We'll keep it pretty simple today because, frankly, everyone wants a break, so we're going to go through this as efficiently as we can. Shadow of the Tomb Raider with DX12 and 1080p will start us off for games. The AMD R5 3500X lands at 129 FPS average here, which places it about equal with the R7 2700X, although with slightly lower lows. And the Intel i7 6700K is also close by. As for the AMD R5 3600, average frame rate runs at 138 FPS, and lows run notably higher, both the benefit of the higher thread count afforded to a game that actually cares about it, and don't forget about the 100 megahertz difference in the frequencies. They're mostly the same, but the 100 megahertz boost delta does favor the 3600, and we know that Tomb Raider is one of the newer games that can leverage the threads too if they're sufficiently fast. The 3600 holds a lead of 6.7% in this game. We were unable to get the 3500X as highly overclocked as some of our other Ryzen 3000 chips, and ended up limited at 4.2 GHz all-core at 1.38 volts. We tried up to 1.42 for 4.3, but it just wasn't holding. The 4.2 GHz all-core OC pushed to 136 FPS average, a gain of 4.9% over the stock performance. Frame times have also improved on average, pushing to 85 FPS 1% low from 78 originally. The new performance has it just behind the R5 3600 stock CPU. We have some launch day results with the 3600 that has SMT off, which had it at 132 FPS average, and with similar lows the R5 3500X stock CPU. It makes sense that performance would be almost the same and serves as good validation. The 100 MHz delta is now a remaining difference as the cache and core counts are the same. Hitman 2 is our next DX12 title. We'll look at some 1440p results shortly. At 1080p, the R5 3500X managed 107 FPS average, which is tied with the R5 3600 with SMT off. The R5 3600 under stock conditions managed 115 FPS average, a lead over the 3500X stock by 7.9%. Lows are mostly the same, especially since the older data, the 3600, might get a slight boost from modern BIOS updates. The average should remain almost exactly the same, but lows can sometimes be bumped by single digits. Overclocking the 3600 didn't do much here, but overclocking the AMD R5 3500X pushed it to 109 FPS average, which also didn't do much here. It's a gain of about 2.4%. It's not much to be had from an OC in this title. The 3600 is clearly the better part. If you could get the 3500X for really cheap, maybe it'd be worth it, but the loss of balance and more thread-bound applications in games is hard to justify, and at least in the Western market, you have a lot of better options available. Moving on to 1440p, we're obviously bound by the CPU still, so frame rate barely changes. Things are stuck at 106 FPS average, as the bottleneck hasn't moved for Hitman 2. Assassin's Creed is one of the games that typically shows a meaningful difference with the thread count changing. The 3500X stock performance had it at 106 FPS average and 70 FPS 1% lows, with an overclock improving to 110 FPS average. The R5 3600 ran 7% faster in average frame rate, although the lows weren't tremendously affected. As for the R5 2600, that's at 99 FPS average when overclocked to 4.2 GHz all-core, or 90 FPS average when left to stock. The 3500X is actually not a terrible deal in this situation. It just depends on if you can get it for closer to that $120 mark. Civ 6 gives us a look at AI simulation through turn time processing duration. The R5 3500X finishes the, that was close, almost called it the 3600, but no, the R5 3500X finishes the average turn calculation 35.3 seconds, which has it marginally slower than the 35-second time of the AMD R5 3600. The 3500X is not faster than the R5 3600, which is how it should be, obviously, because the 3600 is 100 megahertz faster minimally, but the thread count is also not useful here. Civ has always favored frequency over threads, with only one or two exceptions where the higher thread counts help. Overclocking the 3500X gets it up to a 34-second turn completion time in Civ, while the R5 3600 at 4.3 GHz, the same as the 3600X at 4.3 GHz, which we've listed, landed at 34.5 seconds. These are within error of each other between the 3500X and the 3600 OC. F1 2018 is next, giving us a DX11 look at things. This game runs high frame rate on all of these CPUs, but that means it gives us a really clean comparative hierarchy since we're not capping out on the GPU. At 1080p, the R5 3500X ran at 261 FPS average, with lows similarly spaced to the R5 3600. The 3600 held a slightly higher average with a 2.4% lead, establishing that the higher thread count doesn't help much. But it's still in the lead from its 100 megahertz higher boost, and to some extent, the threads can occasionally alleviate the load. Not all 12 are needed, but going to 8 can help in this title. The 3500X at 4.2 GHz runs at 265 FPS average, just behind the 3600 at 4.3 GHz and its 271 FPS average. As for the SMT toggled off result, the 3600 climbs to 273 FPS average as a result of its, partly of its reduced T-die, which means that higher sustained boosting frequencies under Precision Boost 2 are held, which is explicitly different, by the way, from PBO and should not be confused. 1440p pulls the average down from a slight GPU ceiling that affects some of the scenes in the benchmark, but we're still at about 227 FPS average for the 3500X, under both stock and overclocked settings. The 3600 stock CPU managed 229 FPS average, a slight lead, with its own OC also failing to help in a meaningful way. The SMT off 3600 result ran 231 FPS. It doesn't always help to disable SMT, and we certainly don't recommend cutting your CPU in half, but sometimes it can bump FPS. It's just not worth it beyond being an academic exercise. Total War Warhammer 2's campaign benchmark is next, which is a more CPU-bound benchmark out of the two included in Total War 2. The R5 3500X ran at about 156 to 157 FPS average, with the R5 3600 at about 157 FPS average. There's no meaningful difference in this game, but this is also a game where disabling SMT gives a big boost, as shown by the R5 3600 with SMT off at 165 FPS average. If anything, SMT is detrimental in Total War Warhammer 2, but that's also seen in the HEDT CPUs that we don't have listed for this review. You can see some of that behavior in our 3175X revisit if you're interested. The 3500X overclock gets it to about 164 FPS average, or a reasonable boost in this title of about 4.2%. GTA 5 is next, returning us to the oldest game on our benchmark. This one is fun because it allows us to better see scaling through the ages, particularly as core and thread focus is limited back down to the i5 era of 4-core, 4-thread CPUs from 2015. At 1080p, the AMD R5 3500X ran at about 102 FPS average, whereas the R5 3600 ran at 104 FPS average. The delta is small and imperceptible to a player, but it's measurable and repeatable. The lows are not meaningfully different between these two results and are within error for GTA 5 1080p. We need to rerun our 3600 OC result for this game, so it's not listed here, but the 3500X OC gets it to about 110 FPS average, 111 maybe, and suffice to say the 3600 at a similar OC should perform similarly because the base SKUs already show that behavior. We'll start some production benchmarks next. We typically include a lot of these, but we're going to keep this one shorter than usual because it doesn't matter. Not many people are buying this chip, and if they are, it's not for production. And also, we sort of want to break from these CPU things, so we have 5 to 7 minutes off for the holiday, but no more than that. We're also removing most of the HEDT super high-end CPU results from these charts, like Threadripper and the 3175X, because they're just so far away in pricing. Watch our 3175X revisit if you want to see the HEDT performance. Adobe Premiere with our 1080p 60 show floor convention shoot is up first. The AMD R5 3500X 6-core CPU required 5.8 minutes to finish this render, as compared to the AMD R5 3600 and its 4.8-minute completion time. This is where we start to see some of the real gains. A 1-minute reduction is about 17% less time to render between these results, which becomes significant as project size scales. The threads do actually help. The AMD R7 1700 at 3.9 gigahertz is a good example of this. It's comparatively slow, and it's an old generation of Zen, but the extra 4 threads help push it to about the same performance as a modern R5 3600. The 3500X just doesn't do well here when compared to the 3600. Our more intensive 4K 60 A-roll and B-roll render has the AMD R5 3500X at 19 minutes completion time, which allows the R5 3600 a noteworthy 25% render time reduction. These gains scale with more intensive projects, especially those that draw upon the cores more heavily. And it's clear that the 3600's 14.2-minute render time becomes noticeable at scale and at the current size. Blender is a more thread-intensive task than Premiere, so this should be easy to predict overall. With the GN Monkey Head render, Blender has the AMD R5 3500X finishing in 39.9 minutes, the same amount of time as the 4-core, 8-thread i7 6700K. The AMD R5 3600, meanwhile, takes 38% less time to render with its doubled thread count. The 100 MHz frequency delta certainly helps, but we're mostly able to isolate that SMT, unsurprisingly, isn't just a straight 2x increase in tile-based render performance. Still, nearly a 40% time reduction is important as a difference, and it's a reason you shouldn't spend the same amount of money on a worse part, if you didn't already have enough of those reasons. The GN logo render had the 3500X at 46 minutes, compared to the R5 3600's performance of 30.8 minutes. That's a render time reduction of 34%. The 3500X stock CPU ends up about the same as the 7740X, which is a 7700K, and it's not distant from a 9600K. Let's just limit the tests here. Photoshop will be our last one for this video, and it gives us more of a frequency-dependent look. That said, Photoshop has started to show some utilization of threads in the last year. It's still been frequency-dominated, as you can always see by looking at the 9900K results, where a 5.1 gigahertz 9900K and 9700K perform functionally the same. The R5 3500X scores 931 points in the aggregate scoring of transforms, warps, filters, scales, and other Photoshop loads. The 3600 scored 957 points, which isn't really much of an increase, and there is still that 100 megahertz delta. The two are mostly the same in this test, given that the threads don't really matter for Photoshop between these two CPUs. The R5 3500X actually did surprise us a little bit in its value because it can be worth it versus the R5 2600 when the 3500X is properly $120 and it's got $4.21 shipping from AliExpress, which is what we saw at the time of working on this review. That's actually pretty competitive. We have definitely seen it around $200. We paid closer to that price with the expedited shipping, with getting gouged, all that. But at $124-ish versus $120 for the R5 2600, the 3500X is better. It's worse in Blender due to the thread deficit. It's worse in Premiere sometimes, but it's way better in gaming. That said, you're buying a CPU from China, so that means longer wait times to get it, potentially poor or unusable warranty experiences, and really no ongoing support. So that does make us hesitate a lot on recommending it. It is a little bit of an odd part because it's not officially a US or a Western part. But strictly in terms of performance, if you really can't afford the 3600 and you can't afford to wait an eternity to get the 3500X, it's technically better in gaming than a 2600, which is about the same price. There are other options too. Of course, Intel's got stuff out there as well to consider, but we're just looking at this from a perspective of 2600, 3600. It's definitely worse than a 3600, especially if you get it at the same price, and it's better than a 2600, probably overall in gaming at least. So the 3500X is interesting, but probably not worth it. It sort of reminds us of the 1500X and the 1400 from Zen 1, which were also not really an arguable buy. It made a lot more sense to buy an R5 1600, which at the time wasn't that much more expensive. And the 1400 especially just really made no sense. But this is sort of reminiscent of that. A 6-core, 6-thread part being so close to a 3600 just feels sort of bad to buy. And at $120-ish, it's not terrible if you could get it locally and maybe a little cheaper, because the R5 2600 used, or not used, but new prices as AMD tries to dump the stock, it's pretty competitive and affordable these days. So should you buy it? Well, maybe if you are in somewhere in Southeast Asia and you can buy it relative to the pricing of the other AMD products, it might be more worthwhile. But in the West, we do have pretty good options compared to this one. And then the last major sort of invisible pricing factor to consider is the shipping, because it probably won't be free. You might be able to get it, the subsidized version from AliExpress, but otherwise it does cost money to ship it from China. So that's the 3500X, kind of interesting, but it's more of an academic exercise, really. It's not necessarily something we'd recommend buying, especially for people who have access to the R5 2600, or if you have the budget, the 3600. Absolutely do not pay $200 for this, though. That's a ripoff for sure, because then you should just be buying a 3600 and get it in 2 days instead of 5 weeks. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.